All right, praising God for as much as anything, his mercy. Let's actually call this chapter the obedience of faith, not because that term comes up in this chapter, but because I think this chapter points back to that term that comes up in chapter 1 and chapter 16, the final chapter of this book. And because this chapter 3, seems to so heavily emphasize things like faith and grace, I think it's super important to make sure that those terms do not come untethered from the way that Paul connects faith to obedience. In this chapter, that's going to start out in the first 8 verses, building off of what he established in chapter 2, which is no matter what you call yourself, your behavior is what God is going to judge you according to. And of course, that's how we invest in that savings account we mentioned in chapter 2. And so it's going to beg the question, what advantage is there in being Hebrew or Jewish? And he's going to say much in every way. You're going to be advantaged in a set of 8 verses that's going to bring rhetorical questions that seem to challenge the value in trying to worship God, because it just seems too hard. And that's the way I sum up those rhetorical questions, but they don't seem to have a logical pattern as much as they seem to be questions that resist the things that Paul has taught over the years, quite possibly to either this church or other churches, as life. If you've lived for very long, if you tried to live according to God's law, it can get frustrating. It can seem thankless. And it seems that those 8 verses bring some of the challenges to the value in serving God that Paul might have dealt with over the years. But that's just my guesstimation. Either way, what he is actually talking about is going to continue on in verses 9 through 18. They're going to say, even though you are advantaged in God, especially by being a Hebrew, you are not better, because quite possibly those reasons or justifications for feeling that serving God is kind of pointless is going to motivate both Jew and Gentile to reject the things that God is calling us to do, because they sometimes just seem too hard. And so we all fall into the temptation to find excuses to do something other than what God has called us to do. And so he's going to say in the famous passage, all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. There is none good, no, not one. And no matter whether we grew up in God or apart from God, we all have that same struggle in common. As he's going to then say, for that reason, it seems in verses 19 through 20, the law brings accountability, not justification. Why? Because even if we grew up finding value in serving God, and 9 out of the 10 things, hypothetically, that he's asking us to do, we have down cold, the law is not going to relax that 10th thing just to cut us a break. We are going to be held accountable for our failure to follow that 10th thing, or our tendency to find excuses for ignoring that 10th thing. And therefore, the thing that really provides us justification or righteousness before God is mercy. And it's not literally going to say mercy, but it's going to seem to boil mercy down into 2 concepts. First of all, faith in Christ Jesus and the grace that goes along with that. Those are the things that can provide us justification, as verses 21 through 26 describe, going on to answer the question, okay, what happens of boasting? Well, that might be the reason why justification comes through things like faith and grace and not the works of the law, because verses 27 to the end of the chapter are going to say that boasting is excluded, not by works of the law, but by the law of faith. Begging the question, well, what happens to the law since faith plays such an important role in our relationship with God? Well, he's going to say in the last verse of the chapter, we have a faith that actually upholds the law. It doesn't disregard it, even though our works or checking our boxes is never going to make us righteous before God. Thus, I thought that the obedience of faith was an important anchor from chapter 1 to link this chapter to. Why? Because it just seemed like a good idea to me? No, because the last verse of the chapter talks about the way that the faith of God actually upholds the law. And instead of saying, okay, well, which parts of the law? In the next chapter, chapter 4, he's going to give us the example of a man who found a healthy relationship with God through his faith that motivated him to obedience before there ever was the law of the people of Israel. Understanding that, Abraham is going to be that example, and he is going to help us see the distinction between mere belief that idly thinks about God. As James said, even the demons believe in God and shudder. But the difference is, what does belief, or I was going to say faith, what does belief drive you towards? And that is more or less the biblical faith that God describes. And as we said, he is going to illustrate through Abraham, describing the life of a man who had a healthy relationship with God before the law of Israel or the law of Moses ever even existed.